back to my channel. So I'm carrying on reviewing Robert Chapman's Empire of Normality. We are now on to, I think it's part 5 now, I think. So in my previous video I was just talking about how I disagreed with his rather rosy portrayal of how he thought life was like for disabled people back in feudal times. This idea that just because disabled people were more likely to live in a community in feudal times, that therefore they were necessarily accepted. Back in feudal times, generally disabled people were in a community, looked after by their families, as opposed to being incarcerated in the big institutions that came later. But I was saying how I disagreed with his idea that just because that was the case, that they were necessarily accommodated, or that people in feudal times were less discriminatory. I just don't think there's any evidence for that, and I think that's very naive and kind of portraying it as like this very sort of like golden time, and there's no evidence for that. And I was just saying how I disagreed with that. Certainly, one of the big arguments in this book is all about the so-called creation of normality around the with the birth of around the sort of time when during the birth of capitalism, and how the concept of normality, which was applied to human behaviour in a way in which it never was before, how this then led to increased oppression of disabled people, and yeah, it's certainly the case. Actually, the word normal itself is actually comparatively recent. I think it was sometime in the 16th, I can't remember the exact date, it might have been sometime in the 16th century when the word normal was first used in relation to, I'd have to double check, I think it was around the 16th century when the word normal first entered English, and it was derived from a Latin normalis, I think. I'd have to double check. Yeah, it's a Latin word, and normal was first used to refer in carpentry. I'd have to double check. Was it used to refer to right angles or something? I think I'd have to double check. But anyway, yeah, it was a word used in carpentry, and it was only later on that it began to be applied to human behaviour. And before that point, people didn't use the word. Normal wasn't in the vocabulary. People didn't use the word normal. But just because that's the case, that doesn't mean though that prior to that, people were more lenient towards people who were diverging, if you like, from the norm. Even if they didn't use that language, it doesn't mean that they were more accommodating. I just think that's so naive, and there's just no evidence for that at all. Anyway, so that's where I got up to. What I'm trying to say is that just because the concept of normal didn't exist prior to that, before the word came into use, sort of thing, and then later on applied to human behaviour, just because the concept of normal hasn't always existed, doesn't mean that people didn't still have a sense of rightness or correctness or what was expected, and obviously they saw it in sort of very religious ways, and because they're highly superstitious. I just don't think that they were any nicer or more accommodating towards disabled people because they didn't have a concept of normality. I just think that's really naive to think that. And if anything, the evidence suggests that, disabled people were treated absolutely abominably back in medieval and pre-medieval times. Anyway, getting on to the book again. So the point that I take issue with essentially is that Chapman says there was an acceptance of a wide range of ways of functioning and accepted in industrial era. There's no evidence for that, and he doesn't evidence it in the book at all. It's just a claim, an unfounded claim. He says that capitalism allowed the body itself to go from being understood as a dynamic organism to being a working or a broken machine. He says the mode of production itself favoured the reduction of people to living machines, and that they were seen as working or broken in relation to productive potential. In industrial England, as new machines and workdays were standardised, the ideal worker was likewise standardised. For example, they needed to be mobile enough to travel to the factory, and they needed to work in line with the pace and production norms of industrial workplace. Factory workers could not have any impairment which would prevent him from operating the machine. The economic necessity of producing efficient machines for large-scale production established able-bodiedness as the norm. He says the body came to be judged as being working or broken in relation to the individual's real or perceived productivity, and everyone's output was compared with everyone else's due to being in competition. And that there was a kind of a need to assess and distinguish the unemployed, able-bodied poor from the disabled. So a need to sort of categorise, to divide the unemployed, able-bodied poor from the disabled. So in 1697, there was the Badging Act, which required everyone who relied on parish relief to wear a badge that declared their initials and pauper status. By the 19th century, capitalists see workers as individual machines, working or broken. This artificially produced transformation. There was an artificially produced transformation of humans into mere machines for the production of surplus value. There was a shift from viewing health as harmony to normality. And then Chapman talks about the Belgian statistician Adolphe Crutelet, and I'm probably not pronouncing her name correctly because I'm very bad at pronouncing names, so forgive me, I may well be pronouncing his name wrong. Adolphe Crutelet, a Belgian statistician, and he created the first science of human normality, and this then later gave birth to medicine, criminology, psychology, and eugenics. And it was the origins of statistics that grounded his thinking. And Chapman also talks about the German mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss, who in 1801 created a bell curve shaped graph and introduced the error curve, where errors were deviations from the norm. So now normal was associated with correctness and abnormality was associated with error. And then we had the French Revolution, 1789, and this revolution strove to free people from religious dogma and a feudal system, and the new state required the counting of everything in standardised ways, in universal and objective ways, with the goal of improving society. And Crutelet wrote a book in 1835 called The Average Man, which proposed a new science of human normality. And the concept of the average man was helpful for understanding the normal state of health, and this allowed notions such as the average heart rate to be developed. The average man was seen as the ideal person of post-revolution France, and everything differing from this average man was seen as a monstrosity. And the average man was also associated with moral goodness, and the abnormal was seen as a mistake of nature. This was seen as democratic because each individual, from the most able to the most downtrodden, was given an equivalent weight to every other one for the very first time after the French Revolution. Yet, this also justified a so-called average class, resulting in a sort of bourgeois dominance So this argument for the average man was in fact scientific justification for moderation and middle class ideology. The middle class being seen as the best class, the class of moderation and the ideal, because this was very much, the French Revolution was very much a middle class revolution. So the body of man in the middle was seen as the exemplar of the middle way of life, and those who sat further from the average man of a Pacific nation, for example, a black man in a white majority nation, were considered comparatively monstrous. So the further away you sat from that average white middle class man, the closer to monstrosity you were seen to be in this hierarchy of value, and this normalised racial nationalism. The notion of average man did not just help medicine advance, it also helped naturalise the new ideologies and hierarchies of capitalism. And the ideal person was the white middle class man with typical ability, and that was seen as good. And then Chapman also talks about the 17th century English concept of a mean understanding emerged, the mean understanding, and with that gave rise to new forms of discrimination. And the new concept of a natural fool allowed such mistreatments to be seen as part of a natural order. And the concept of a mean understanding took hold because it allowed cognitively enabled people to make sure they had a monopoly on property, excluding so-called idiots from, as they were called back then, from inheriting property, and the means of production. So excluding cognitively disabled people from inheriting property and the means of production, and this was framed as part of the natural hierarchy. At first, this was not based on statistical analysis. The soundness of mind was loosely determined by legal professionals who would ask questions about general knowledge or maths to determine someone's legal competence. That would exclude me then, because I can't do maths. And there was also hierarchies. And there were also class hierarchies were naturalised as well. For example, the working class were seen by ruling classes as having inherently lower ability to reason, and also race and colonialism were put very low, and this also naturalised colonialism as well. So there's a lot of these hierarchies were also very racist as well as being very classist. Chapman also talks about phrenology, which is the natural hierarchy of minds. Which phrenology being a very pseudo-scientific, I mean it's not science at all, but at the time it's taken very seriously, where, this idea that somehow you could work out someone's character just based upon the shape of their skull and things like that. All of this was designed to naturalise the hierarchies. Okay, I'm going to move over to the next video now to carry on going over the points Chapman made in this book, so moving over to video number 6 now.